Welcome. If you're a woman who has a sense that there's more out there for you, you're in the right place. I'm Whitney Baker, host of the Electric Ideas podcast. Somewhere along the line of work and kids, life carried on, but I lost track of my truth. I'm on a reflective journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Each week, I interview a woman who is lighting her own path and offering others hope. Before our conversation ends, we'll share a reflective question for you to explore. Sometimes all we need is a jolt, a fresh idea, an aha moment that connects us to a sense of possibility. This, my friends, is what I call an electric idea. Welcome back to Electric Ideas. I'm your host, Whitney Baker, and this is a Mini Jolt, a short episode where I share inspiration and simple practices to help you reconnect with yourself, to honor your needs and desires, and to recenter yourself right in that messy middle of midlife and motherhood. Today, we're going to talk about giving ourselves permission in life and as mothers to slow down and to acknowledge and try to flow with instead of fight against the different cycles of demands that almost all of us flow through as caregivers. And in the second half of the conversation, I want to make sure I leave some space to talk about the idea of fallow periods in our life and how we can shift our perspective of these periods and learn to trust these seasons of life that don't necessarily look productive on the outside, but are doing really important work underneath the surface. So I have to come clean and say, over the last couple of weeks, despite all of my life practices for rhythms of self-connection and living with intention, I have noticed something creeping in. I've had this feeling that I hate of being backlogged, of being behind, of being slightly scattered. And it's coming off of extra caregiving for a sick child in the middle of a season when my husband's role has shifted at work and it requires more time and travel for him, which translates to me taking on more at home. And also on the heels of fun family travel. And I just want to acknowledge that sometimes, even when there isn't a major disruption or when there's a disruption that's joyful, like a trip, it can still knock us out of our sense of equilibrium. It sets us up for more logistical work as mothers and less time because we're gone. In my house, a small way that translates right now is being patient and asking my family for more help with, for example, the extra piles of laundry that are creeping around. Anyway, so I felt a bit unsettled, a bit behind, which is an icky feeling for me because when I'm in this state, I know I'm not accessing my highest sense of self. I'm not sharing my best energy. I don't feel expansive. I don't feel as present as I want to because my brain is more likely to get into that state of the mom ping pong where I'm trying to make sure I don't drop a ball. So when I start to feel this way, I try to pause and plug in as quickly as possible because I don't show up with the steadiness I want to in my relationships or my work. So I want to listen to myself and give myself the awareness I need to recalibrate. However, something that it's taken me years of being in this space to deeply understand and acknowledge that might help you feel a little bit more self-compassionate towards yourself is that being a mother and a caregiver disrupts linear living and the degree to which we have capacity. So motherhood, as all of you mothers listening know, simply doesn't follow any straight, predictable lines where we can assume we're going to have the same amount of time or energy to share. I'm guessing every single one of you has experienced that feeling like the rug is getting pulled out from underneath you because there's unexpected appointments or sick days for the kids. There's unplanned sleep disruption. There's spikes and demands for our emotional labor. Shout out to anyone else raising a teen daughter and navigating social media and screen time and all of that very emotionally demanding stuff. It's time we acknowledge that the lives of mothers are inherently unpredictable and nonlinear. And I can tell you that every single one of my clients experiences ebbs and flows of energy and ability to contribute to their needs and desires and expansion, depending on what's happening with their family. So lately, I've been thinking a lot about what might feel different for mothers if instead of constantly fighting the truth that we often are caring for the ill, that our bodies change, that we're upshifting or perhaps downshifting work in many scenarios in order to try to find a situation that works for both us and the greater well-being of our households? What changes when instead of fighting this, we can move with these ebbs and flows and allow the waves and regrouping periods to be expected and embraced and just part of life instead of something we need to battle against? There's a certain peace and empowerment that I found when I choose to surrender to these cycles and know that they will pass. I'm extra pensive right now, probably because it's the winter season and super cold, and everything in nature is gray and stripped bare where I live in the Midwest. And I've been keen on looking to the natural world, which we are a part of as a teacher lately. Even though women, especially mothers, sometimes treat ourselves like we're machines, we are animals. We were never meant to be always on or always producing, even though our modern on-demand culture and availability of technology not only makes it possible, but rather glorifies maximizing every drip of our capacity. This outlook simply doesn't work for the lived reality of mothers. Sticking to my connection with nature, it's an attitude that leaves me feeling depleted, maybe even pillaged. I wish I would have understood earlier in my life period as a mother that you have more power than you think to build a meaningful life and contribute at a pace that doesn't constantly negate your capacity. Just like we don't expect nature to be in constant bloom, we can't dehumanize ourselves and demand uninterrupted productivity. To do so from a woman who is a caregiver is not only to deny biology, but to deny our humanity. So the shift really happens when you fundamentally choose to believe that pausing, turning inward, resting are not just a nice to have, but they are regenerative. I grew up in Iowa, and I know when crops are grown repeatedly without allowing the soil to rest or replenish nutrients, the land becomes less fertile over time. And the same holds true for us as women. So even though the culture we're swimming in calls us to constantly move forward and optimize and always be productive and always be available and always be on, what if we recognize and appreciate the disruption and demand that come with being a mother, with being a caregiver, and trust our need to slow down, to replenish, to pause in any given day, week, or year? And instead of seeing this pause as a failure, can we view it as a necessary, essential part of a life cycle of expansion and contraction that allow us as women to flourish long term? All right, I know this is getting rather philosophical, so let's pause for a quick reflection, and then I'll share a quick practice that you can use in your everyday life to ground yourself a little bit more into this idea. So pause here and ask yourself, what would look differently in my life right now if I trusted that rest is generative, that learning to slow down and define and claim rest for myself is how contribution and creation become sustainable? So here's a quick practice for you to try this week. Look at your commitments across the board. Look at your time. Look at all the places you need to go, the things you've committed to doing. See if you can build margins into your days, some white space. For example, I have 2 days a week where I can send a link and people who are invited to can book time on my calendar. However, I have it set up so there's always a 15-minute buffer space between calls. There will never be a time where I have back-to-back calls. And this is just a teeny tiny way I build rest and break into my day in order to honor my capacity. I also hold space for myself every morning where I'm pouring into myself and practicing being a human being, not a human doing, first thing in the morning. When we build these buffers into our days to check in and replenish, it's much less likely that we'll get into a state of overwhelm or total self-abandonment. Also, just a quick side note that, well, today I'm focused on a more literal slowing down just because, like I said, I've been a little backlogged, a little bit depleted, a little world weary the last few weeks. And I'm trying to honor that and tend to that. I want to remind you that sometimes you might not be so much physically tired, but rather disconnected or uninspired, out of touch with your spirit. Rest doesn't just mean pausing or sleeping or napping. It's individual, but it certainly does not mean laying on your couch and mindlessly scrolling. I deeply explore the 7 types of rest in my Electric Ideas podcast conversation with Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith. This includes categories such as social rest, creative rest, sensory rest, for example. You would probably love this conversation if you haven't checked it out. If you're interested in listening to that, just search for the title Recovering the Lost Art of Rest and Electric Ideas wherever you stream, and it'll pop up. Okay, so we've just acknowledged that the lives of mothers are routinely disrupted, whether it's a kid unexpectedly home a day or two sick, or the dishwasher breaking down and us doing more hand washing and having our schedule disrupted, trying to figure out and be home for some window where someone comes and fixes it. Those become almost expected blips in our journeys of motherhood that we get to pay attention to and notice when they've thrown us off course, how we can be generous with ourselves, how we can build in that white space and buffer space to recenter ourselves a bit. So that's just part of the routine cycle for most moms. But I want to go a bit deeper into this and let you know that some of you are in or will likely experience what I call fallow seasons of life. So fallow seasons are a period of intentional downtime where we expect less of ourselves. We allow for reduced output and perhaps more time to turn inward, to reflect, to set ourselves up for renewal and set the stage for future growth. Most of us are not taught how to embrace and sit with the sometimes discomfort of these periods. I'll give you an example from my life. When I quit my corporate job years ago in a bittersweet burnout huff, I wanted to be more present for that super demanding period of motherhood with 2 very young girls, as well as a stepson who was flying past milestones. What I needed, and I wish I could have articulated and claimed for myself, was a fallow period. I needed some time for intentional restoration, for reduced output that would give me that space to realign with myself. Instead, I frantically updated my resume and tried to start freelancing in kind of a panicked mode within the same week of quitting my job. It was rather frantic. I put tons of pressure on myself to figure out what was next for me and to make up for what felt like lost time with the girls. But what I didn't know then that I understand now is that pressure and frantic action kept me locked in that same sense of chasing life versus slowing down, enjoying, and inhabiting what was right in front of me. I needed to experience a fallow period where I just slowed my roll, but I hadn't learned to trust it yet. It took me years and tons of learning to trust periods of unknown and to not have the need to force answers or actions all the time. So a truth it took me years to understand is that no one ever told you you have to live in a constant forward-leaning state. Sometimes a lot of the rushing around we do is stemming from fear that so many of us as moms have absorbed subconsciously: fear of not being enough, fear of falling behind, fear of missing something, fear of losing momentum. Slowing down requires courage and trust that's meant for us will ripen when the timing is right. Sometimes we have to slow our momentum to make sure we're headed in the right direction and that we're not completely bypassing our needs and denying our capacity along the way. I know this conversation is reaching all of you in different points of capacity in your own motherhood journey, but it's okay to take the time to ask yourself, Are you tending to yourself, mind, body, and soul? Are you listening, or are you just racing on to the next thing that might leave you feeling overscheduled or overextended and committing and forcing action without checking in on yourself first? So as we come to a close, I invite you to think about slowing down or embracing a fallow period of life, not as wasted time, but rather as a time that is more of a pregnant pause. Especially during these bigger transitions in life, you want your momentum to be guided by truth and clarity. And sometimes instead of growing or blooming right away, we get to give ourselves space to root first. Remember that women's lives are rarely linear, especially when we become caregivers, and that when we learn to give ourselves grace and embrace the natural ebb and flow of our capacity, then we can truly meet and support ourselves where we are. I want to be sure to mention here that one of my favorite times to work in a one-on-one coaching capacity with women is during what I call a season of shift. This could be a new phase of motherhood. For example, when your kids are finally in elementary school and you have a bit more capacity, you're coming up for air and you're like, wait, where did I go? Or, for example, you quit your job for now and you're ready to reclaim parts of yourself that have been dormant or abandoned. Remember yourself outside of the roles you've been playing, and you don't want to squander your energy, but you don't really know where to start. On the other side of the coin, some of you are in seasons of spikes in demand where you feel like you just cannot find space for your own needs and desires consistently. One of my specialties is helping moms create what I call micro rhythms that allow them to show up for themselves inch by inch, despite the real demands of their lives, so that while they acknowledge the ebbs and flows of capacity that we've been talking about in this conversation, they get better at not running themselves into the ground or getting in cycles of complete depletion or resentment. If you want to explore receiving this type of support this spring, I'd love to connect with you. You can hop on a free 15-minute Spark call with me. You can find a link in my show notes to schedule this zero pressure time where we just kind of check in. I can listen to what's going on. I might even have a tool or perspective on the spot that I'll share with you, and we'll go from there. Final thought here, just to bring it full circle. I mentioned in the beginning of this conversation that even though we sometimes treat ourselves as machines, we're animals. Animals don't defend their need to conserve energy when resources are low. And trees don't explain why they're not ready to sprout new buds. When we recognize that our non-linear way of being as mothers is part of life, we can flow with and ride with these cycles of outward energy and expansion, but also honor and embrace times when life needs to contract, when we need to simplify, when we need to conserve our energy, when we need to look inward for clarity before we move forward. Just like nature, we can attune and adapt to our environments, and it's one of the most self-loving things we can do. I always end with an opportunity for reflection, so ask yourself this: how can I more gently honor and inhabit the wave of life I'm in, and how much capacity I have right now in my season of caregiving? All right, that's all for today. Don't forget to take advantage of a free Spark call if any part of you is curious about what it looks like to have some support and accountability from someone who understands the nuanced ins and outs of the motherhood journey. I only open my calendar a few times a year for one-on-one client work. So if this is feeling ripe for you, I look forward to meeting you and learning more. Thanks, and have a great day. I'm so glad you joined me today. If you're looking for more, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. And if you enjoyed the show, I invite you to support me by leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Hope you have an inspired day.